You wake before the hour you set for yourself, though there's no alarm out here, and never was. Only the darkness thinning slowly, and the cold thinning slower still. 3 walls stand around you, packed snow shaped by your own hands the evening before, and on the 4th side, where the embers are, the shelter stands open to the fire. Past that open edge begins a distance you haven't paced out today, but know from the maps. The nearest person is a day's walk from here, maybe 2, and sound in this kind of cold carries so far and so clean that last night you heard your own cough come back off the far ridge. The embers are still breathing a dull orange, and when you prop yourself on one elbow to feed the fire another log, there's a small cloud of breath standing right at their edge. It isn't yours. You haven't breathed out yet. The sleeping bag's still zipped to your throat, and still the cloud hangs a little higher than your own breath would sit, and holds longer than breath holds in cold like this, and then drifts sideways, though heat is meant to rise, as though a draft had caught it, though the air is so still you can hear the embers cracking one at a time, each on its own. You watch the spot for a minute, maybe 2. No tracks, no sound, no shape beyond the firelight, only the mist, already thinning, and you decide you must have seen your own breath, bounced back off the snow at some odd angle, and you lie back down. This isn't your first winter coming out here. You like a particular kind of solitude. No radio, no companions. A route you plot yourself at home in the evenings. Thick pencil on a thick map, where a line across the white looks like nothing but a line, and out here turns into decisions you make alone, step by step, with no one else's opinion to lean on. The axe by the entrance, the stove at your side, the sleeping bag zipped to your chin, and the whole point of the night is one thing: reach dawn without spending body heat on a single wasted movement. You pack the snow walls the same way trip after trip, the same motion of the hands, the same height every time, as though you'd learned it in your body rather than your mind, and the open side always faces the fire, turned away from the dark at your back. You settle back into the bag, leaving the strangeness unanswered, and fall asleep faster than you expected. And in the morning, you wake with a clarity your body hasn't held in a long time. A clear head from the first second, a steady step, hands finding buckles and straps without one wasted try, not once fumbling, as though someone had stood watch through the whole night instead of sleeping through it. And at first, this simply pleased you. You'd get up thinking you had finally found the route where the body starts working the way it should. One winter passes, then another. You come back here and to places like it further north, laying out the same 3 walls of packed snow, building the same fire of driftwood and dead branches. And on most of these nights, close to the hour before dawn, the same cloud you never breathed appears right at the edge of the light. Sometimes it stands where you yourself stood half a minute earlier, just up to stretch your legs. Sometimes it holds where neither of you could physically be standing, right at the top of the snow wall, a head higher than you are. It never stands where you could reach it without moving, and it never stays there longer than it takes for you to notice it. The steadiness of it stops surprising you before you're ready to admit it. You notice the mist, glance at it the way you'd glance at a familiar sign of weather, and settle back into the bag without another thought. And in the morning, you get up again with that same clarity, the same steady first movements, the same clear head working without any warm-up, the same order in which the body does what you ask of it, not once slipping through the whole night. You've stopped asking yourself where it comes from. The sign is the same trip after trip, and the surprise it gave you at first quietly becomes part of the kit, a thing you carry along and don't talk about. One winter, further south than your usual route, where the snow walls come out straighter than they ever have, the mist appears behind you, past where the embers reach, where the dark starts right at your shoulder. You don't turn at once, Deliberately not at once, counting the beats inside your wrist, and by the time you do turn, the cloud is already sliding sideways, slipping out of your sight faster than you can adjust to it. It doesn't come a step closer. It behaves the way someone else's breathing behaves in a room where you thought you were alone. It turns up somewhere other than where you're watching, holds for less time than it should, and leaves in a direction the heat has no reason to pull it. You try to catch it out. You sit so the whole edge of the light is in front of you, nothing behind. And then the mist doesn't come at all, not a single time the whole night, as if it too has a choice in whether to come. By this winter, you've started checking yourself in the mornings. You deliberately hold off before sitting up in the bag. Wait a minute. 2. Listening to your own body from the inside and find nothing but that same clarity. A clear head, movements precise from the first pull, a sleep that hadn't slipped, not once, as though someone had honestly sat through it in your place. You try to remember even one morning when your body let you down out here, stumbled, took its time waking up, and you can't find a single one. The sign holds exactly as it did on the first night, and you're the one now looking for the catch in it, not the pleasure. It comes closest to you one night on a bare ridge, where you build the shelter lower than usual, pressing yourself tighter into the snow, because there's no wind, but the altitude strips the last spare movement out of the body. You wake in the middle of the night, because the air in front of your face is already occupied. Not by a sound, not by cold, not by anything you could name as a cause in the ordinary way. The mist stands so close that if it were yours, you'd feel its warmth on your lips. But you feel nothing. Only see the breath a single inhale away from your own mouth. And it holds there, steadily, neither closer nor further, as though someone were breathing in time with you, on a rhythm that isn't yours. You don't move. You just watch it hold level with your breathing for a minute, maybe longer, and then it drifts sideways into the dark and disappears, without the snow going any deeper anywhere under a weight that isn't there. The stars over the ridge stand so thick and so still that it feels as if the whole height has been holding its breath along with you. And only when you close your eyes again does the air around you finally settle back to where it was. Years go by, uncounted, with no single day when it stopped being news. And one evening, at your own table, you lay out the maps of every winter route you've ever taken, all at once, one over another, because you're about to plan a new one and want to check it against the old. The lines settle over each other in layers, years on top of years, different ridges, different rivers, different snow walls built by your own hands in different winters. And when you step back from the table to see them all at once, you see something you never saw in any single trip. On its own, every route looked like a simple, sensible choice. Go round the ice, cut along the ridge, stay out of the narrow gorge on a short winter day. And only all of them together, laid one over another, add up to a shape you never drew. Every line, drawn fresh at different ends of different winters, bends away from the same one point on the map, curves around it in an arc, as though something stood there blocking a straight path through. Though all you remember in those places is level snow, no mark on the ground, no reason to turn aside. You never once chose that detour on purpose. It always felt like you were simply choosing a higher stream, an easier pass, a gentler slope. And year after year, the pencil line follows the same arc, as though the route itself knows what to avoid, even when you don't. You trace that point on the map with a finger, not quite touching the paper, and write nothing beside it. No name, no question. You simply fold the maps back in their old order, slide them into the tube, set the tube back on the shelf where it's always stood, And in the notebook with next winter's route, the line you draw that same evening already pulls away from the same arc on its own, as though the hand remembers it before you get round to thinking.
There were 10 of us, and we were 5 days in, and the snow always went harder by evening than it had been in the morning, and the skis ran stiffer for it, as though yesterday's track had time to freeze solid before we ever came back along it. Inside the tent, while whoever was on watch fed the stove, the air warmed within the hour to a little over 20 degrees, the ordinary warmth of a house, and 3 steps away, past the canvas, its own 35 below held steady, and we knew that difference as surely as we knew the watch rota, an hour each, round and round, all through the night, until it got light enough to let the stove go cold with the morning, and the rest of us slept in a heap the whole time, feet toward the middle where the stove hummed, 10 of us under one shared pile of blankets, breathing the same way. The same person had worked out the rations for years, and always split them by the head count. 10 bowls, 10 rusks of an evening, 1 pot of porridge between all of us. And that was how it had been done since winters long before this trip, without a single argument between us, because the sums were simple and always came out even, day after day. On the 5th evening, there was less porridge left in the bottom of the pot than there should have been for 10 full bowls, and none of us said so out loud. Hands go numb. The grain might have been measured out wrong back home. The snow in the pot settles unevenly and makes it look like there was more of it than actually went into the bag. But that same night, something happened, and only later did we understand it was already part of the same story. Someone had taken the pot off the snow too early, before it was properly melted, and we started asking each other who'd done it, and it turned out to be no one.
Each of us in a tent said, one after another, that we hadn't gone near the stove in those 10 minutes, and we believed every word at once, because lying about something so small would have served no purpose. And we asked again, louder this time, whose idea it had been to take the pot off, and no one had an answer. We put it down to a mix-up in the watch rota and went to sleep without thinking more of it, because small things are small things, and there weren't many hours left before morning. In the morning, we shared out the usual portions of porridge, and each of us finished the bowl to the last spoonful and wiped it clean with bread, same as always. And yet by midday, half of us were talking about food as though we hadn't eaten since the evening before.
It wasn't hunger pangs and no dizziness. It was something else. A flat, almost unnoticeable feeling that what we'd eaten hadn't been enough, though the portion had sat there full, exactly the same as yesterday and the day before, and the spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl the way it scrapes when there's truly nothing left. At first we joked that it was the cold, that the frost was burning through calories faster than we could count them. And then we stopped joking, because by supper that same day, the rations came up short again, and this time the shortfall was bigger than the first evening. And now all 10 of us felt it, not just half. That same evening, the 2 of us who'd gone ahead to scout a clearing for the night came back and said they'd found a good spot among the firs, sheltered from the wind, and we made camp right there. And afterward, once the tent was up and the stove lit, we asked those 2 which of them had seen the clearing first, and said, "Here," and both said they couldn't remember, that the decision had somehow already been made between them, without a word, before either of them had the chance to open their mouth. And we asked each other again whose idea it had been to stop right there, out of every other suitable clearing along the way. And again, out of all 10 of us, no one had an answer. That evening, the quartermaster counted the stores 3 times over, laying the rusks out in 2 rows on the oilcloth, lips moving, finger tracing the lines in his own notebook, and we waited without a word, because we could see from his face that the numbers hadn't matched up for more than 1 day of this trip. We worked it out exactly, how much had been packed at home, how much should have been left on the 5th day for 10 mouths, how much actually lay in front of him on the oilcloth, and the difference came to precisely 1 extra portion at every meal. as though the rations had been worked out all along, not for 10 mouths, but for 11. And afterward, the quartermaster sat a long while over his notebook, though there was nothing left in it to write. We didn't say any of this out loud that night. We just lay closer together, feet toward the stove, listening to whoever was on watch feed the fire. And somewhere in the dark, one of us asked whose idea it had been to keep the stove burning right through the night without a break, instead of letting it die down for an hour or two toward morning to save the wood, the way it had always been done on past winter trips. And the answer was silence, because it turned out no one had ever decided this out loud. It had simply been the rule since the first evening of this trip, as though it had settled itself among us while we slept and couldn't decide anything at all. On our watch by the fire that night, every one of us heard the same thing, though we didn't all say so to each other straight away. A quiet, steady sound from where the sleepers lay, as if someone were chewing, slowly, unhurried, without opening their mouth wide. A sound so ordinary and so homely that for the first minute it slipped past unnoticed, the way the creak of the sled runners does, or the crackle of the coals. And only afterward did we start to listen properly and realize it wasn't the coals, because all 10 of the sleepers lay still, covered by one shared sheepskin coat, and there was nothing in anyone's mouth. And still the sound went on, somewhere close to the stove, steady, matter of fact, as though that was simply how it was at this hour of the night, and whoever was on watch would just throw on another log to stop thinking about it. In the morning, we compared our watches, one after another, round the circle, and it turned out every one of us who'd sat by the fire that night had heard the same sound, word for word the same, right down to which side it came from. By morning, we decided to go back down our own ski tracks instead of breaking a new trail through the gully as we'd planned before. And while we packed our rucksacks, someone asked whose idea it had been to go back the same way, since the plan had been different, written down at home on paper before we ever left. And again, no one could say where the decision had come from. It had simply been made for all of us before we'd exchanged a single word about it. And the whole rest of the trip now depended on it, the whole remaining way to the road and the car. Already on the way down, at the long rest stop, the quartermaster finally found the mistake, and the explanation turned out to be so simple and so complete that we were amazed we hadn't spotted it sooner. Right at the start of the trip, back home while packing, one sack of grain had been entered twice on the list. Its weight counted into the total in advance, and the sack itself had simply never gone into the pack, left behind on the scales in the hallway. And the whole shortfall, from the first day to the last, was explained by that one figure, with nothing left over, not one question without an answer. The rations really had been split fairly, 10 heads, 10 shares. It was only that all 10 of us had believed from the start that more food had been taken than actually had. And that was why every portion, the whole time, truly hadn't filled us the way it should have. That explanation went round the club quickly. Everyone nodded. And ever since, we packed the grain twice, calling out the weight of each sack out loud before it goes into a rucksack, and the habit has stuck without a single argument. The way anything sticks once it's saved you from making the same mistake twice. But to that place where we camped that winter, among those same firs, our club has never once gone back since. None of us decided this out loud, not at a single meeting, not at a single planning session before the next season. It's simply that when the question of the route came up again the following year, someone proposed one option and someone else proposed another,
And it turned out both options led away from that clearing, though no one named it and no one asked outright why we don't go there anymore. And every year since, it's someone else who's first to name a different place at the meeting. And we ask each other whose idea it was, and as usual, no one has an answer. And in all these years, the route has still never once found its way back to that clearing.
On the big lake, the one that in winter turns into a flat, white field without a single tree or landmark to fix your eyes on, 3 men used to pitch a tent right out on the ice, 3 kilometers from the nearest shore, at the spot where the sound underfoot always suggested the deepest water. Tolik, Seryoga, and the younger one, Zhenya, had been coming out here for more winters than they counted, hauling the same auger, the same old echo sounder, and a thermos none of them ever remembered to wash out come autumn. They knew where to drill. They knew which ice would hold a snowmobile, which would hold a man on foot and no more, and which wouldn't hold anything at all. And they knew one more thing they almost never said aloud to each other. The ice on that lake groaned and cracked all night long. Long, low blows, as though something very slow were turning over somewhere far beneath the water. And that sound, the older fishermen on the lake liked to say, always came from one direction, from the far shore, the one 3 kilometers off. And from that same direction, if the old men were to be believed, came everything else that ever happened out on that ice. Those who'd fished this lake for years kept a habit they never explained and rarely discussed out loud. They set the stove against the tent wall that faced the near shore, kept the door on that same side, and laid their sleeping bags with the feet pointing toward the far shore. It wasn't quite a rule, more the kind of habit that outlives its own reasons. The way some men never cut the outboard on deep water, though none of them could tell you exactly why not anymore. Tolik, Seryoga, and Zhenya pitched the tent this time the way they always did, door toward the near shore. But for once, they moved the stove to the far wall, purely for comfort, because the cold pulled in harder through the doorway. And not one of the 3 so much as remembered the custom that had held on this ice a good deal longer than any of them had been coming here. Dark came down fast, the way it does over ice that open, with no hills, no trees, nothing at all to slow the eye. And by the time the 3 of them were sitting round the lit stove, with the stillness outside so complete it had a kind of weight to it, Zhenya was the first to notice the smoke from the flue leaning off sideways, in one straight ribbon, as if a draft were pulling it, though the candle flame by the door stood without a flicker, the tent flap hanging dead still, and not a breath of wind moved a single snowflake anywhere on that ice. Tolik said it was probably just the way the flue was set. Seryoga agreed the pipe ought to be moved next time, and the 3 of them went back to their tea, and no one looked that way any longer than it took to notice it. The night went on, the ice under them letting out short knocks, then a long, low groan that spread out underfoot and died away somewhere distant. And with every one of those sounds, the smoke from the flue grew bolder. First, just leaning off sideways, then lying almost flat right along the ice, crawling toward the far shore in one long gray-blue band that never tore and never thinned, lying over the snow as if someone had set it down there on purpose, and not a breath of wind anywhere to account for it. Seryoga kept shifting gear through the night. Things that had sat by one wall at dusk turned up nearer the other wall by morning. And every time he only said he must have set his pack down badly to begin with. And every time he put it back without checking which way it had actually moved, and lay back down to sleep. By then, the hole they'd drilled nearer the shore they'd walked in from had already skinned over with young ice, thin but tight,
as if something were sealing it from underneath on purpose. While the hole by the far wall, the one that faced the direction the smoke kept crawling toward, never took so much as a skin all night, and the water in it stood open and black, even as the frost outside only deepened toward morning. By the part of the night when the talk by the stove had long gone quiet, and all three lay zipped into their bags, the smoke was already leaning in tight around the tent, pressed close along the canvas on one side alone, while on the other side, the one that faced the near shore, it never came near at all, not a breath of wind, and not the smoke either, as if some line ran there that it didn't dare cross.
None of the three saw any of this by then, because all three were asleep. And all three, if anyone had looked in through the loosened flap, would have been lying with their heads turned the same way they'd quietly turned themselves over the course of the night, all three toward the far shore, as though sleep had taken hold of them gently and slowly and turned them the way deep water turns a boat lying on its side.
Zhenya woke first, well before any light, because sleep simply wore thin and let him go, with no jolt, no sound, as though someone had simply stopped holding on to it. The first thing he saw opening his eyes was the stove nearly out and the last thin thread of smoke crawling along the tent floor, curving round Tolek's bag on one side and Seryoga's on the other, slipping out under the edge of the flap where the canvas didn't quite meet the ice, and going on outside as drifting snow moving in exactly the same direction, though the air over the lake still stood so still that he could hear the dying fire tick in the stove door, and somewhere under the far edge of the ice, another short groan rise and fall away. He went out quietly so as not to wake the others, and stood a while by the entrance, looking the way it was all heading, toward where the dark suggested a flat line of far shore, unseen but somehow felt, the way you feel the tilt of the floor in an old house, your feet pulling one way before you've decided to walk there at all. That night, Zhenya crossed the ice in the direction the smoke leaned, stopped, listened to another long groan travel away underfoot, and went back into the tent and said nothing about it to Tolek or Seryoga in the morning, and stayed just as quiet the next time and every time after that. Year after year, the smoke grew bolder, as though it had to relearn the way each time after a summer off. First, just leaning off sideways again, then lying low along the ice again, then wrapping the tent along one side again. And each year it happened faster than the trip before, earlier in the evening than the last. And in the stillest part of the night, when the ice groaned least, the whole pattern showed itself at once. The way steam over the hole by the far wall curled off exactly where the smoke from the stove was leaning. The way drifting snow round the tent lay down in long lines, all pointing one direction. The way the flame in the lantern hung by the door, nowhere near the stove, nowhere near the gap in the flap, still leaned the very same way, not a breath of wind anywhere to explain it, as if the flame itself had some dim notion which way the lake was leaning that particular night. Zhenya went out on nearly every night like that, each time a little farther from the tent, each time without a word, each time back before the others stirred. And if Tolek and Seryoga ever noticed his bag colder than it should have been come morning, or the snow by the door pressed down farther than usual, they explained it to themselves the easy way. A man has his reasons for stepping outside at night, and never asked further. And in all their years out there, neither of them once asked why the stove stood at the wall it wasn't meant to stand at by the lake's own custom, or why that custom held on, season after season, as stubbornly as it did. Other fishermen, the ones who pitched their tents farther off, closer to their own holes, sometimes glanced over at that stovepipe from a distance and quietly took note of the very thing Zhenya saw up close, But going over and explaining another party's custom to strangers wasn't done out there either. So they simply packed up their gear and left a little earlier than usual, right around when what little wind there ever was on that lake dropped away completely. A few more winters passed, and they never went back to that lake, because that spring, upstream, they opened the spillway on the dam that had held the water level steady for years, and raised it high enough that the old bottom, the one that had frozen solid so many seasons, the one that tent had stood on so many times, went under several meters of water and never again, come winter, froze into that same flat field, because the depth there was a different depth now, and the bottom was a different bottom entirely. The spot where the smoke had once shown so patiently and in such detail which way that lake leaned now lies somewhere under all that water, and there's no drilling a hole there anymore, and no trail left on ice to find, and none of the men who might still remember the exact coordinates will ever go back to look. And if one of them did, there'd be nothing left to look for now besides a stretch of flat, dark water that, if you stand on the new shore some long winter evening and watch it long enough, seems to lean ever so slightly the same way too. I'm sitting by the tent's guy line, facing into the dark, the radio resting on my knee, and my call sign tonight is second, because on the rope I climb second, right behind first. And first is asleep in the next tent and has no idea I've spent 3 hours now talking to a man I've never once seen in person, only heard over the radio. Camp sits on the far side of the glacier, past the ridge of Seracs, and the voice comes through with a faint hiss, as if the air itself strains the words through snow before it lets them go. There are 4 tents here, and since evening they've all been strung together with a fixed line, because you can't see crevasses under fresh snow, and at night nobody moves between the tents unclipped, not even for the 10 steps to the next vestibule. Tomorrow, early, this whole rope team goes out on the route, and every knot holding the tents and the gear tonight will be holding people at altitude tomorrow, where a bad knot stops being something you can blame on tiredness. That's exactly why we check every guy line twice in the evening, and exactly why I know by feel which knot belongs where before I even swing the torch onto it. We check in every hour on the hour, because that's how it's done on this training camp. Right at the top of the hour, the button clicks, a call sign sounds, a short report goes out, wind, temperature, state of the ropes, and then silence again until the next click. Between check-ins, I could switch the radio off, but I don't. In the quiet, the air isn't really quiet. It hisses softly, steady, and almost kindly, as if someone on the other end is holding the channel open just in case. At 10 in the evening, I make my first call. Second to camp, in position, quiet, -12, over. The voice doesn't answer straight away. Static first, then level and even. Camp receiving, -13 here, no wind. All is planned till morning. Off net till 11. We both know the report could be cut down to one word, but that's not how you run this net. Because a long sentence is proof the man on the other end is still alive, still breathing, still choosing his words, not just leaning on the button. After sign-off, I set the radio down beside me and look out at the ridge. The gap before the next check-in is a whole hour, long and even, until somewhere near the middle of it, with no warning at all, the cold comes down on me at once, whole. There's no wind. The temperature's the same one they called out over the radio, but the skin above my gloves, at the wrists, grips so hard I pull my hands in against myself, and it's the first time all night I notice the difference between the glacier's ordinary frost and this. At 11 I come on again,
And this time, camp reports first, without waiting for my call.
Second, we've got a new knot on the guy lines here. Neat, but not one of ours. I don't even know how to tie it. The voice says it flatly, the way you'd mention the weather, and I answer that it's quiet on my end, though that's not quite true. I just haven't gone out to check my own ropes in the dark with a torch yet, and I don't want to. The gap after this check-in is shorter than the last one, and the cold arrives in it earlier, before I'm even halfway through the hour, as if the gap itself has drawn in tighter, and in that tightness the cold finds me easier than it did before. I tell myself it's a draft off the ridge, though the flag on the tent isn't moving at all, and I keep watching it anyway, just to give my hands something to do. By midnight, I finally take the torch and go round my own tent's guy lines. And on one of them, where there was a plain figure 8 in the evening, there's now a knot I don't know. Neat, tight, with a double wrap in it, as if a hand from some other school had pulled it snug and certain, knowing exactly what it was doing. The torch beam shakes over it longer than any ordinary check needs, because I'm trying to read the shape of the knot and work out where it's from. Not our school, not what I was taught, not anything I've seen at any training camp under any instructor. The knot holds perfectly, tighter than I could ever pull one closed one-handed in a glove, and I look at that flawless work far longer than an evening check would ever call for. I stand over it for a good 3 minutes before I realize I can't remember whether I ever tied anything on this guy line at all, or whether it had always been like this. At midnight, I come on and tell Camp about the knot. He listens a long time without cutting in, then answers, not so flat this time. Second, we've had an addition too, and not on our own ropes. First tent has 2 new knots now, both correct, both foreign, and both look like they were tied before any of us ever got near the place. I ask if they've woken first, and Camp says no, because there's nothing worth telling him yet. The knots hold, the ropes are sound, and there's no reason to wake a man before a climb over a piece of good rope work. The gap after this check-in is short now, properly short, and the cold comes almost at once, well before the half hour, as if the gap has shrunk together with the cold and both of them have run out of room in it. By 1 in the morning, Camp gets there first on the next check-in, again before I do. Second, have you noticed the cold comes the second I let go of the button? There's no gap left at all. My lungs go empty in the same breath the call ends. I say I've noticed too, though I thought it was only me, and somehow the admission doesn't help. By 2 in the morning, there are more knots across the glacier, and every one of them is getting the gear ready for the climb. One guy line retied so it holds better than before, another shifted to the right angle for tomorrow's traverse, a third shortened just enough that nobody will need to redo it in the morning. On the fixed line between my tent and First's, a new knot appears where there was only slack before, and now the rope runs tighter, truer, as if someone had already worked out our weight for tomorrow and set the line for exactly that. Something I can't see is bringing our gear to the state we'd have wanted it in ourselves before setting off, only we never got round to it, and I don't know whether to be frightened or grateful. So in the end, I just keep going round with the torch, because standing still is colder than moving. At 2, we check in, and the exchange goes slow, in long sentences, because nobody wants to talk fast on a night like this. And somewhere in the middle of my own sentence, in the tiny gap between 2 words, I feel the cold go straight through me, right where I draw breath to say the next word. And Camp on the other end says it before I do, as though he hears that second separately from my voice, through the open channel. Second, your voice just cut out there. Did you feel that? And I say yes, just now, right between that and yes. By 3, the exchanges have gone short, properly short,
And it isn't tiredness. There's almost no gap left between the words for the cold to fit into on its own anymore. It stops waiting for a gap and simply travels with the words, inside them, so that I can no longer say where the sentence ends and the frost begins. And camp, in this same long session before dawn, tells me the guy lines at First's tent have all been retied again, every one, and come out even better than before. And I agree, because I don't know what else there is to say about someone else's work of that quality. In the morning, once the light's already turning the ridge gray, I go round the camp in daylight and find my own guy lines plain and ordinary, as if nothing had happened in the night at all, while the ropes at First's tent lie so clean that the group spends half the next day asking who did such a good job retying them, and nobody owns up. The fix line, which was still sagging last evening, is now pulled tight and perfect, knot after knot, and everyone heading out on the route today checks their harness against it, like a textbook example. First comes out of his tent, stretches, looks at his own flawless harness, and says it's sitting on him today like it was molded to him, tighter than he's ever managed to pull it himself. We strike camp, clip into the rope team, and set off on the route, and all day long I hear nothing in my earpiece but the standard reports: altitude, wind, pace of the group. Nobody mentions the night's knots out loud again. But before we head out, Camp says one last thing to me, shorter than a usual report: that he was glad to stand watch with me, and that at future camps, if a night shift ever comes round again, he'll make sure to put himself down for it with me one more time. Nothing happened to me, not because I did anything right, but because there was someone nearby who interested them more. That man is alive, well, still climbing to this day, and seems content. And I know that for a fact, because I still see his photographs from new summits sometimes, where the ropes on him are tied flawlessly, better than any of us managed at that old training camp. I've never once asked him about it. We reached the tree line near the end of the week, and after that, it was proper tundra, apart from the odd pile of driftwood and old reindeer trails, buried in snow almost level with the drifts around them. The days were much alike: up before light, skis on, a short lunch standing up, skis again until dusk. And there was less and less talk, because talking cost you something out there in the cold. Your breath went ragged and the words froze in the air before they reached the person next to you. Nobody complained, because there was nothing to complain about. The weather held, the going was easy, and the one thing that changed from day to day was how much snow we had to melt for the evening meal, because that time round I was drinking noticeably more than usual, and never noticed it myself. Some days we saw nothing alive at all, apart from tracks and the odd bird. In the evening, as soon as we stopped and pitched camp, the first thing we did was look for snow that was firmer and cleaner, to melt for water and for tea. I remember that particular evening, not because anything unusual happened, nothing did, but because the water in the pot tasted unexpectedly good that time. Not just melted snow, flat and flavorless the way it usually is, but faintly sweet, as if somebody had tipped a single grain of sugar in with it. We melted it every evening in the same soot-blackened pot, taking turns, while the rest set up the tent and sorted the packs. And that night, I drank my mug and poured a second one straight after, a thirst I hadn't planned on, though I never usually drink more once we've eaten. And nobody in the group noticed, because everyone drank their own, from their own mug, watching their own fire. The next day, we brewed tea on the same water, and the tea turned out sweet too, sweeter than the leaves we'd been drinking all week. Instead of one mug, I drank 3, and by midday, the thirst was back, as if the water wasn't staying in me at all, just passing straight through and taking with it whatever it is you actually drink for. I put it down to altitude and cold,
Anyone who spent a long stretch of winter out there knows you drink more in the frost, and thought no more of it, because there was another long stretch ahead of us, and working out the taste of water on the move seemed beside the point. The rest drank as usual, a mouthful at each stop, and I was the one who kept falling behind to scoop up snow. We saw the camp in the late afternoon of the third day after that pass. Smoke first, thin, barely there against the gray sky, then dogs barking somewhere ahead, then the tents themselves, 3 or 4 of them, standing in a loose circle on open ground where the wind strips the snow down to bare earth and reindeer tracks run off in every direction, as though the herd had passed through just a moment before. They took us in without any fuss, as if skiers came through regularly enough that nobody was surprised. And when we asked about somewhere to sleep, they simply pointed at the tent on the end and told us to go in. No questions about where we'd come from or where we were headed. And that quiet hospitality said more than any amount of talk would have. Somewhere behind the tents came a soft, steady clinking. Harness, maybe, or a bell on a reindeer's neck. And that was the only sound breaking the stillness we'd walked into along with the camp. Inside, it was cramped and low. Bare earth under the hides, a fire pit in the middle, and the smoke went up through a round hole at the top that somebody glanced at now and then, as if checking the draw. And the smell of smoke mixed with the smell of hide and something else I couldn't put a name to. It was warm from the fire, and after a whole day in the wind, that warmth hit you all at once, right through the body. But there's no need to say more about it than that. It was simply there, the way warmth is in any home in winter. Along the walls, among the hides and blankets, lay the household things. Harness, a few tools, coils of rope, and further along the same wall, tucked among the same hides, a couple of the family's children lay sleeping or pretending to, the youngest hardly more than 5, and none of them spoke to us or seemed to notice us at all. Just strangers in the house for one night. Nothing out of the ordinary for this place. Our host, a man of about 50, a man of few words, handed us water in a big soot-blackened bowl. The same one, by the look of it, the family drank from themselves, and I, having stepped out earlier for snow, had already scooped up a handful straight into my mouth on the way out of the habit you pick up on long stretches. Both the snow and the water our host had given us turned out sweet, sweeter than plain melted snow has any business being, and the thirst afterwards didn't ease off. It only sharpened, as if the taste stayed on the tongue and fed itself, and you wanted to reach for the mug again before you'd even finished the one in your hand. The host noticed me reaching for a second mug in a row, and said, without much thought, sorting through harness by the entrance, "We boil this water twice." Just said it, no weight behind it, not even looking my way. In the same tone you'd use to say the snow came early this year, or that a dog's better off not fed before a long haul. He didn't explain why, didn't wait to see whether I believed him, and it seemed to matter to him not at all whether I did. One of our group asked why boil it twice if the water looked clean enough already, and the host just shrugged and repeated the same thing, word for word, as though the question was beside the point. That's how they put it, and I, of course, didn't believe it. Not seriously anyway, though I nodded and said I understood, and set the mug I'd started aside. That night the tent was crowded, everyone sleeping close together. Someone else's breathing right beside me, someone else's language on the other side of the wall, where the hosts talked quietly between themselves about something of their own, and I lay awake a long while, but not out of fear, more out of not being used to the closeness in the strange house, the smoke smell that never quite cleared, and the low crackle of embers in the fire pit, which someone seemed to be watching even at night. I lay there thinking the explanation was probably simple enough. Meltwater can be hard, can carry some local mineral, harmless to people born there but rough on a stranger's stomach, and boiling it twice just kills off whatever the locals had long since got used to. It was a reasonable enough thought, and it settled me. as much as you can be settled on somebody else's floor, under somebody else's hides. But it wasn't frightening. I'm not the sort who sleeps badly somewhere unfamiliar. And I dropped off fairly quickly, leaving the mug I'd started with the last of that water still in it by my head. And it seemed to me that even asleep, I could still taste that faint sweetness on my tongue. We left early the next morning, while the hosts were still busy with their own work, and none of them came out especially to see us off. An ordinary goodbye, short, without much said, much like the whole night had been. From that day, I started boiling snow water twice, not because I believed the host, but more because it was easier to just do it than to decide all over again each time whether to bother.
A habit forms faster than a conviction does. And within a week, I wasn't thinking about why I did it, just setting the pot back on the fire a second time, automatically, the way you brush your teeth before bed without remembering what it's for or who first thought of it. The others from that trip seemed to have forgotten the whole conversation before that winter was even out. For them, it was just one more detail of the trip, like the name of the pass. But for some reason, I hadn't, and my pot has stood on the fire twice ever since, whatever else there is to do around it. A good many years have passed since then. I've been up into the mountains and out across the tundra more than a few times since, with other people in other places where nobody's ever heard of that tent or those hosts. And every time I melt snow, I boil it twice, though the host's explanation had long since worn off, and only the action itself is left. I never did find out whether there was any local rule behind what he said, or just one man's passing observation, tossed off beside his own fire. And I don't exactly believe it, not even now. I just go on doing it, because once, in a tent, among hides and smoke that weren't mine, the water tasted so sweet that even now it sometimes feels as though I'm still a little bit thirsty, and that feeling has never quite gone away. We've been digging the cave into the snowdrift for 2 hours now. The snow here is dense, packed hard, and it comes away under the knife in almost even slabs. And when the entrance finally narrows enough to take the rucksack like a cork, I feel the blizzard outside seem to step back just far enough to give Vera and me this small space under the snow, tight, round, smelling of raw cold and melting wax. Vera sets the candle on a shelf she carved herself with the same even stroke you'd use to cut bread, and says it's warmer in here than outside, 20 degrees at least. And it's true. Snow holds heat as well as felt does, and I believe it at once, without a shred of doubt, simply because I feel the difference on my skin within minutes. Vera has a watch, a plain mechanical one, left to her by her father, and she checks it every time she wakes, though waking here isn't really any different from just lying with your eyes shut. I keep another kind of count in my head, one I trust almost more than any dial. If the day has started outside, the ceiling of our little burrow pales into that even gray-blue light that any half-meter of snow gives off, even with no direct sun, even through cloud. That light doesn't care whether it's blowing outside or not. It arrives with the dawn every single time, like an alarm clock that needs no batteries, and on our first night here it came exactly when it should have. Just after 7 to the minute, matching what Vera's watch remembered. Waiting in the cave left nothing to do but talk, and in the first hours we talked about everything, freely, not counting our words. Vera told me how her brother had finally decided to move to another city, and that she was thinking of visiting him come spring, if the snow melted early, and that come spring she wanted to go south anyway, to the sea, somewhere snow never touches at all. And I answered with people we both knew, who'd married whom,
who'd moved away, who still owed me money from last autumn. And the talk moved easily. Long sentences, digressions, names of people who mattered to no one here but the two of us. When the ceiling began to fill with gray-blue, Vera's watch read 7:25, and she remarked out loud that dawn had come a little late today, 15 minutes at most. The blizzard must be thicker than usual, the snow deeper where we dug. Nothing to wonder at, she said, and we both believed it readily, because believing a simple explanation is easier than lying there and inventing a complicated one. We slept, woke, slept again. In the dark, there's no schedule to it. Only the wish to shut your eyes becomes the one way of telling 1 hour from the next. When I opened mine again, Vera was already chewing on a biscuit and dividing the last of the nuts into 2 uneven little piles, and our talk had thinned on its own, as if its channel had narrowed. She asked how much gas I had left in the burner. I said enough for 2 days if we were careful. She wanted to know whose glove was wetter and whether we should dry them both over the candle at once or take turns. And in this talk there was no more brother, no more sea, no more people we both knew. Only food, gear, a tally of the little we still had to hand. The gray-blue light came that time when the watch read just short of 8. Not a quarter of an hour late now, but nearly a whole hour. And Vera said the watch must be running slow, though she knew as well as I did that her father's mechanical watch had never once run slow, not in all the years she'd worn it. And she said it quietly, as if she didn't quite believe herself. By then, we'd stopped checking the watch altogether and simply began waiting for the light, lying side by side, watching the spot where the ceiling was meant to pale. Our talk narrowed again, now down to whatever was right in front of us. Vera said the candle flame was leaning to one side, which meant there was a gap somewhere in the snow. I answered that the gap was probably by the entrance, where the rucksack didn't sit quite tight in the passage, and we both listened to the wind droning somewhere very high above us, muffled, steady, as if through a blanket, and found in that drone something like a conversation. About nothing at all now, just to hear each other's voice. We took to sleeping when it grew dark up there, and waking when the gray-blue filled it again, and it turned out we no longer lived by the watch, but by that light, which kept arriving later, first by 15 minutes, then by nearly an hour, and after that by something Vera could no longer put a number to, only shaking her head in a dark I couldn't see but could hear in her silence. There were fewer words left between us. I'd ask, "Cold?" and hear back only, "No." She'd ask, "Awake?" and I'd answer just as short, one word, because whole sentences no longer seemed to fit in the small air between us, as though the cave grew tighter for sound with every hour, though we'd stopped digging snow and the walls hadn't moved. Sometimes one of us would just say some word out loud, the name of a town, somebody's name, a number, for no reason at all, only to hear that the voice still worked, that there was still someone else here in the dark, besides the breathing I could hear, very close, right at my shoulder, even and unhurried, like a metronome that had run down, but for some reason kept on going anyway. The last time we tried to speak at all, it came out not as talk. Vera began quietly, almost without parting her lips, to repeat one of those counting rhymes children learn for picking teams. No sense to it at all, just a row of words, one after another, low and even. And I answered with nothing, only moved closer and breathed, slowly, so she could hear that breath instead of an answer. And it seemed to be enough. Breath was a word too, the last of the few we had left, and we lay like that so long, lips unparted, that I stopped knowing whether I was asleep or only waiting. And the difference between those two states came to matter to me no more than the difference between two identical snowflakes. When the light finally came, I didn't believe it right away, because I'd nearly forgotten what it looked like, and because Vera's watch by then read either midday or the start of a new day. I'd lost the exact count, only felt the gray-blue patch above us filling in slowly, too slowly, as though the snow begrudged letting it through. And once it grew bright enough to make out Vera's eyes in the dark, we simply started packing. Without a word, without agreement, with the unhurried movement of people who'd each, long ago and separately, made up their minds about the same thing. She rolled the sleeping bag, I pulled the rucksack out of the passage, and the snow that had packed into the gap over that day and night came down on our shoulders in soft, dry flakes. And we both knew, without saying it aloud, that the watch Vera had checked so faithfully the whole way through meant nothing by that morning. The true count was being kept by something else, outside the snow or inside it, and we didn't care which, so long as it let us out, to that sky we'd almost forgotten the look of. We only came out under a real sky towards evening, gray, low, but alive. No blizzard now, and skied down over crust that held our weight almost without effort, and at the car park below, by the car, we hugged briefly, the way people hug when there's nothing left to say to each other after what's happened, and drove off, each in a different direction. Since then, Vera calls me once or twice a year, usually towards winter, and we never speak of that night directly, only in passing, as if we're both afraid that naming it out loud would remind it that it isn't finished. Because for me, it truly never did finish. It's only that on the morning we finally climbed out, that night was taken from us and passed on further. The night itself, taken whole, with all its gray-blue light that never once arrived on time. And I still don't know who has it now, only that it isn't me, and it isn't Vera. And sometimes, falling asleep at home now, in my own bed, I still find myself waiting for that gray-blue light on the ceiling. The one that, of course, never comes here. And I wait for it so long that sleep arrives before I notice it has. I'll go through it in order, exactly as it happened, because the order matters here more than anything else. There were 7 machines in the group, out in the forest tundra, a standard route, one we'd run before, and nothing about it gave any warning. You all know Stas a little. This is his 3rd season with us. Quiet, careful, keeps his machine in better shape than most, lights a fire without matches on principle at every stop. You've probably seen him at the spring meet, the one in the green jacket, always fixing other people's bindings before his own. An ordinary man, one of ours, from the club, and I want you to hold on to that right through to the end, because further on it's going to start sounding like I'm talking about someone else, and it's the same Stas the whole way through. On the 2nd day, Talik's machine broke down. The drive belt came loose and tore against the sprocket, and with the light already gone, we decided against fixing it there and then. We'd pitch camp and sort it out in daylight. We tramped down a spot for the tent, put up a windbreak like a wall. The snow there was nearly waist deep, and we spent an hour packing it into blocks so it wouldn't blow through from the windward side. An ordinary winter camp. The clubs made dozens like it. Nothing much happened in the first hours beyond the cold setting in and the talk by the stove going slow and drowsy, the way it always does on the 2nd night out. That evening, Stas laid out the sleeping bags in their places, helped tighten the guy lines on the tent, checked everyone's ski bindings for the morning, his usual role. He took on small jobs like that more than the rest of us did, and none of us would have thought, not for a second, that we'd be arguing about that evening a day later. Talk of the creek started with Xiusha. When she walked out to the machines to check the ski bindings, she told me about it separately afterward. Said she was walking and could hear Stas's footsteps beside her. He'd gone out too, to check the gear, and the sound of the snow under his feet didn't match how he was actually stepping. The creak came a fraction before his foot ever touched the crust, as though something already knew where he'd put his weight next and crunched the snow half a second ahead of him. Ksyusha put it down to tiredness and the wind, went back into the tent, said nothing to anyone in that first minute, and I'd never have known it all if I hadn't noticed the same thing myself half an hour later. Someone in the room asks whether she might simply have mistaken it for an echo off the tent. No, I answer. There was nowhere for an echo to come from. The ground was flat, no slope, no wall. The sound came straight off him and nothing else. I was standing by the stove myself that night, pouring tea, and I heard Stas walking back from the machines. His steps were ordinary, even, but the creak of the snow under them ran half a step ahead of him one moment and half a step behind the next, as though someone were walking not quite in time with him, though there was only the one figure out there. I said nothing at the time either. All of us said nothing, each on our own, and that's probably the first thing I'd write down for next time if I were ever the one reviewing someone else's incident. By morning, the smaller things started, and there were more of them, and they kept snagging on each other. The flask of tea Ksyusha had made, somebody hadn't poured any for Stas, even though everyone remembered him drinking with the rest of us. His mug stood empty by his sleeping bag since the evening before, as if it had been washed and put away in advance, though there was no one who could have done it. The spare gloves, the pair from the shared box, lay just as neat as they'd been packed back in town. Though Stas had taken that exact pair in the first hour of the stop, I watched him put them on myself. The bag he'd slept in looked by morning as if it had never been unzipped at all. The zip pulled up to the top, the fabric unpressed, though I'd seen with my own eyes Stas climb into it that evening and settle in at the edge of the tent. Small things, each one explainable on its own, but by dawn there were so many of them piled up that the explaining itself starts to wear a person down. Someone asks whether anyone said anything to Stas directly about what was going on. No, I answer, because none of us understood what was going on ourselves. It was just a shared sense that things around him didn't quite add up, and all the while he behaved exactly as he always did, joking, helping with the stove, asking Talik how long the repair would take, and Talik answered him plainly, the way he'd have answered any of us. Talk of the creek came up again, this time between the two of us, me and Mitya. We'd gone out to raise the antenna higher for the radio, and Stas came with us, his hands being freer than anyone else's. We were walking in single file, and I stopped for a second on purpose, no real reason, just to test it, and the sound of his footsteps didn't stop with me. The creak of the snow carried on for 2 more steps by itself, then cut off sharply, as if it were catching up with something that had already happened. Then I deliberately slowed down, and the gap between his real footstep and the sound underneath it grew wider still, further and further behind, as though the snow were answering not what Stas was doing now, but what he'd do half a step from now. Mitya heard it too. I could see it on his face, but he didn't say a word out loud, only suggested we head back, and we did. In the morning, over breakfast, the thing happened that's the whole reason I'm standing here in front of you now. We were going back over the talk from the night before, about next year's route, who'd be driving in from where. Talik was walking through the details, Ksyusha correcting him here and there, me adding my own bits, and at some point I said, "Remember, Stas suggested cutting straight across by the lake," and everyone looked at me as though I'd remembered a conversation that had never happened. Talik said that the 4 of them had discussed the route the night before without Stas, that Stas had been fixing the snowmobile at the time and never came near the fire at all. I stood there knowing I remembered him there perfectly clearly, sitting right beside me,
taking a sip from my mug, asking about the lake. And nobody else remembered any of it but me. And the longer I insisted, the less sure of it I became myself, as though the memory were retreating under everyone's shared stare. By then, almost everyone had heard the creak. It was the evening before we were due to head down to the base. Stas had gone off alone to gather firewood, and the sound of his steps kept reaching the camp even after he'd gone behind the rise out of sight, carried on coming steadily from the spot where he no longer was, for a few seconds more, and then simply stopped, with no transition at all, as if someone had carefully switched the sound off. And a minute later, we saw Stas himself coming round from a completely different direction with an armful of wood, walking steady and unremarkable, as though nothing had happened, and nobody in the camp discussed the mismatch out loud. We just turned in a little earlier than usual, each to our own tent. Someone asks what happened next, whether he came back with us. He did, yes. Physically, he came back, rode his own machine the whole way, got home, and I know he still comes to the meets. You see him in the same place you always did. And this is the hardest part of the review for me, because there isn't much left to tell after that. It's only that the talk about that trip gets a little shorter every month among the others, and he takes up less and less room in it. Someone's already retelling that night without him in it at all, and for some reason, I'm the only one still holding the whole group in my head. Today, the creek came up again, but not from me this time. While I was getting ready for the review, a woman from another crew came over to me. She'd been in the club long before I joined, and asked whether I was going to talk about the snow that creaks, not with the footsteps, but just beside them. She'd heard exactly the same thing on a trip of her own, many years back. And back then, too, it had been tied to one person in the group, someone who afterward became hard to remember anything definite about. I asked her how it had ended for them, and she said it hadn't. Not really. The man simply stayed on the club's rolls, kept coming to the meets. People saw him there. They just remembered him a little less with every year. And at some point, the review of that trip was read out here too, in front of this same room, in more or less the same words I'm using now. And by her count, that was about 12 years ago, with an entirely different set of people, on an entirely different route. And here I am, standing here, hearing something close to my own story back from her, only with different names in it, and I don't know what to do with that now, except finish telling it and take my seat in the room, where, as it happens, Stas has been sitting beside me this whole time, listening along with everyone else, nodding in the right places, and in about 12 years, someone in this same room will be reading out a review just like this one, only the name in it will be mine. I've watched this recording more than once now, and every time I pause it at roughly the same point. By now, I already know what comes next, and back then, when I was filming it, I didn't. That's the whole difference between me now and me then, on that night. In the footage, it's night, still early, a December night, and the tundra is so flat the horizon looks drawn with a single line. Not a bush, not a single tree, all the way to the edge. Only snow, stars, and the small red point of the fire, which, watching it now from the outside, I'd call far too small for that much darkness. The sled stands turned sideways, so the wind runs along the runners instead of into your face. The dogs lie in a ring around the spot where the sleeping bag is, and I'm sleeping right there among them, because it's warmer that way, and nobody brings a tent on a trip like that. It's only extra weight on the sled. In a silence like that, a person starts talking to himself without even meaning to, simply because otherwise the silence presses on your ears like they've been stuffed with cotton wool, and your own voice is the only reminder that there's anything alive around you at all besides the snow and the stars. On this trip, I talked without stopping, and the recording picks it up from the first minute. I counted the days of the journey out loud, counted the dogs off by head before setting out, made promises to them, each one separately, by name, that once we held on to the trading post, there'd be dried fish for them, 2 days with no harness, lie about as much as they liked. It's an ordinary musher's habit, not superstition, just a way of holding the rhythm and not losing myself in all that whiteness, where there's no landmark at all except my own voice.
This is the first night, and here I still see nothing. Because back then, I wasn't looking for it. I was settling down to sleep. My hands were cold. I was in a hurry to get into the bag. But now, knowing where to look, I can see, right at the far edge of the firelight, where the snow still holds a little glow before the dark takes over completely, that there are more tracks there than I and 6 dogs could have left in one evening. A little more, barely noticeable, only to someone who already knew what to look for. On the second day, the going got harder. The runners kept catching on the crusted snow, and I talked again, more to myself this time than to the team, counting the kilometers by the sun, promising a whole day of rest now instead of dried fish if we made the ridge before dark. We made it, though it was already dusk by then, and that evening I set up camp the same way again. Sled turned sideways, dogs in a ring, me in the middle, and talked again before I slept, drowsily now, almost without any sense to it, just so the voice wouldn't stop in that silence, which in the tundra isn't like any other silence at all. And here's the second night, and I linger on this spot longer than I did on the last one. Over the course of one night, the tracks moved a good deal closer from the very edge of what the light reached, right over there, past the sled, where yesterday there was only flat, unbroken snow. I never noticed it then because I was asleep. Now I see it clearly. Between evening and morning, more tracks appeared around the camp, and they lie closer than they did the night before. The third day was the hardest. The wind came up from first light. Wind-driven snow scoured my face. The dogs struggled, and I'd stopped counting anything specific. I just talked, without stopping. Promised the team whatever came into my head. A warm kennel, the whole winter off, the best feed at the trading post, if only they'd hold out until evening. And at one point, when the wind howled hardest and hit me hardest in the face, I think I promised something. Not to the dogs anymore, but out loud into the whiteness in front of me, without even thinking about it. Get me there, and I'll give up everything I've got on the sled. Just let me arrive. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was just a phrase pulled out of exhaustion. The kind of thing said plenty of times out there, and forgotten within a minute. I made camp that night the same way as always, only my hands were barely obeying me by then, and I fell asleep almost at once. And here's the third night, and again, I see what I didn't see then. The tracks are right up against the sled now, running along the runners themselves, as if someone had gone right round the camp in a circle, keeping close against the wood and the metal the whole way, never once stepping out onto open ground beyond it. Watching all of it now, straight through, night after night, I keep thinking that whatever gets said out here in all this whiteness, where there's nothing for the sound to bounce off and nowhere for it to go, doesn't seem to dissolve the way it dissolves at home, in a room, or in a city, where 100 other voices cover it within a minute. Out here, the voice settles onto the snow and stays lying there,
And whatever's promised out loud isn't forgotten just because the one who promised it has forgotten. It waits its turn, and it won't necessarily send the bill to the one the promise was made to. On the fourth night, I linger longer than usual again, and again I see more than I saw then. The tracks now run right along the ring the dogs keep, on the outside of it, pressed close against the circle they hold around me all night long. And once or twice, looking closely, I can see the nearest dog, Razbeg, lift his head in his sleep, as if he'd caught some sound just behind him, only to lay his muzzle back down on his paws a moment later. By the fifth night, even back then, I'd already started sleeping worse, though I couldn't have told you why. I just kept surfacing out of sleep more than usual and lying there a long while, listening to the snow crackling under the wind. And now, right at this same spot, I see that the tracks have come right up against the ring of dogs, so close that the shadow on the snow nearly touches the fur of the outermost dog. And every single time I hold my breath exactly here, even though I know perfectly well that nothing sudden happens after this, that the team arrives whole, all 6 of them, down to the last hair. The last camp before the trading post was on a low, gentle rise, the kind of place where by the next day you'd expect to see smoke from the chimneys. And as I was settling in, I took my mug out of the sled for no particular reason. The old tin one, dented all over, older than the team and older than most of my trips, and set it down not beside the sleeping bag, the way I always did, but off to one side, on the bare snow, about 10 paces from the camp, as if I wanted to free up space on the sled that was hardly short of room to begin with. That evening I put it down to tiredness, to not paying attention, to my hands doing something on their own while my head was already half asleep, and I lay down without looking back at the mug. In the morning, breaking camp, I didn't go back for it, and here, that same morning, buckling the straps on the sled with my back to the mug I'd left behind, I see for the last time the reason I keep coming back to this night over and over. By morning, there are more tracks around the camp again than there were the evening before, and this time they come right up to the spot in the snow where my mug stood all night, circle it in a smooth ring, and move on, without touching anything in the camp, without coming a single step closer to the dogs or to me, as if it had been enough for them, whatever was left there on the snow, set apart from everything else. We reached the trading post by the evening of the next day. All 6 dogs still on their feet, not one of them limping or lying down. And I remember being surprised at the time by how evenly they ran that last stretch, as if they'd rested, though there'd been nowhere for them to rest. I unloaded the sled already in the dark, under the lamp over the trading post door, led the dogs to the pen where a shelter and dry straw had long been waiting for the team, and only then went inside, shaking the frost off my collar. I didn't think of the mug once that evening, not because I'd made a point of forgetting it, just because there was no room in my head for it alongside everything else that needed doing after a long trip. Unload the sled, settle the dogs, report the delivered cargo at the post. The recording's coming to an end now, and after this, it's just the road into the settlement. Nothing worth watching. And this is usually where I stop the playback and put the phone down. It's not the first time I've done this, and every time, afterwards, I get up and walk past the shelf above the stove, where I keep the odds and ends too small to throw out and not worth putting away properly. A stub of a pencil, an old compass with no needle, and right there, in its usual spot, right at the edge of the shelf, stands my mug, the same one, the tin one, with the same dents, dry, as if it had just been taken down off the nail by the stove, and not left behind in the snow hundreds of kilometers from here on a bare hill in front of the trading post. I never carried it back. I remember that clearly.
I came back empty-handed that time. I never threw it out either. It just stands there, where it's always stood, and I always drink from a different one.
The club has received your inquiry and replies below on the substance of each point raised in it, regardless of the order in which those points were set out in your letter. Before turning to particulars, the committee considers it necessary to recall the circumstances of that New Year gathering, since without this context, part of the reply would not be intelligible. At that time of year, the club customarily gathers on the clearing by the river, and that particular year, the weather did not favor us. Instead of frost, there was a thaw. The snow was heavy and wet underfoot. The tarpaulin over the communal table sagged with damp overnight, and by morning, the fire was giving off more smoke than flame. Something in the region of 50 people came out to the clearing. The table was knocked together from fir boughs, as is customary. Guitars were played, songs went round the circle, all as in previous years, with the one difference that during that thaw, nothing dried at all. What had been hung by the fire remained by morning exactly as wet as it had been the evening before, and the snow underfoot, instead of its usual crunch, squelched and gave way under every step, so that by the middle of the night, almost the whole camp was standing on churned slush rather than firm crust. Many members, once they were home again, recalled this detail first of all, that particular clinging dampness that refused to lift no matter how much wood was put on the fire. As regards the property left on the clearing, the committee is obliged to report the following. Some of the kit, a pair of mittens, someone's scarf, a coil of rope, a compass, and a few smaller items we shall not list in detail, was set down by the fire that night, in plain view, in a spot anyone present could have pointed to. By morning, some of these items were no longer to be found in the snow. The spot was searched exactly where the items had been left, and where, by every indication, they ought to have been lying, and nothing was found there. The search was widened. Digging went on to either side, then further out, the snow there was gone through almost down to the ground, and it was empty there too, only wet snow and the softened earth beneath it. Someone suggested, half in jest, marking the spot with a stick and coming back at first light, when it would be easier to see. It was marked, and in the morning the digging was done again, in daylight, and the result was the same, as though the snow overnight had simply not remembered that anything had ever lain in it. The items were not lost, and they were not carried off by anyone. The ground, quite specifically, did not give them back. The spot is known. It has not changed since, and we are not able to send you what is, quite simply, no longer there to be sent. The committee understands that this will read to the family as a refusal, but it is, regrettably, a fairly exact description of what actually occurred. There is nowhere further to search, because every place the items might conceivably have been has already been searched. In the record of that gathering, which the committee keeps as a matter of custom after every meet, there are a few notes taken down from what members said, and we set them out here without any comment of our own, since we do not consider it our place to add anything to them, and also because the notes themselves seem too slight to explain anything by. Thus, several people, independently of one another, remarked that the steam over the kettle, lifted off the fire and set aside to cool, hung in the air far longer than it should on a cold night. It stayed visible, a thin gray line against the dark firs, longer than anyone present was prepared to account for, and on one occasion it hung directly over a spot at the table where, at that moment, no one was standing and the kettle had not been moved there. Something similar was said about the drying clothes. Items were hung under the tarpaulin closer to the fire, as is usual in such weather. Mittens, socks, someone's jumper, and the steam above that line did not thin in the wind the way it should have. It hung there in a solid layer, as though there were no wind at all, though the wind that night was blowing steadily and hard, gusting into faces, tugging at the embers, and everyone sitting close enough to the fire felt it. Someone joked at the time that the clothes had evidently decided to dry themselves in their own good time and were in no hurry. Everyone laughed, someone put more wood on, and no one gave it any further serious thought that night, in the way one does not, while a night is running its ordinary course, and no one has asked for any small oddity to be explained on its own. Now, as to the person you ask about separately, and on this point the committee answers with all the directness we can, because we understand how long you have waited for precisely this part of the reply. He did not vanish, and he was not lost. He simply left the club after that gathering and has not answered letters since, which is his own decision, and the club has no authority either to answer for him or to compel him to correspond. We have information that he is alive and well, and we pass that information on to you in good faith, but we cannot oblige him to write to you, any more than we can return items that are, quite simply, no longer on the clearing. Your letter, with your permission, we passed on to him through mutual acquaintances, since the club does not currently hold a direct address for him, and that is the whole of what lies within our power on this part of the matter. We remember him well from that evening, and in writing to you, the committee found itself recalling him with more warmth than concern, if it is fitting to put it that way in a formal letter. He sat closest of anyone to the fire, telling some long and tangled story about the drive out, about turning off the main road and losing the track and doubling back more than once, and everyone laughed, and someone kept topping up his tea from the communal flask, and his cuffs were soaked through, after he had gone in up to the knee at the stream earlier that day, and spent the whole evening warming himself at the fire in those same wet clothes, because he had not bothered to change, saying it would dry on its own, that it would dry faster by the fire than in the tent. And here, in the notes referred to above, there is one detail which we set out likewise without explanation, because we have none to offer. According to those who stood near him while he talked and gestured, waving his sleeves close to the flames, steam did not rise from his wet cuffs that evening at all, not once, though steam from other people's wet clothing at that same fire stood in the air that night, as we have already written above, a good deal longer than it should have. It should also be said that during that thaw the ground stopped giving back more than the items. That part of the night that came after the guitars, when the singing had grown quiet and gone round one voice at a time, cannot now, if those who remained at that gathering are asked, be recounted the same way by any two of them. One remembers certain songs, another remembers different ones. One states with confidence the order in which they were sung, and that order differs from person to person, while for some there is simply a gap in memory between the late hour and dawn, and even silence, with not one recollection in it, although everyone who was there insists they were not asleep and had not moved from the fire, that they simply sat and listened along with everyone else. The committee does not undertake to explain this either, and asks you not to mistake this silence for any unwillingness to answer. We truly have nothing further to add to what has already been set out above, and we would rather write honestly that we do not understand it than invent an explanation we do not have, and which would only sound more convincing than the truth. The committee is aware that this letter has run longer than is customary for correspondence of this kind, and that part of what is set out here does not sit easily within the usual form of an official reply. We decided nonetheless to set everything out in order rather than reduce the letter to a few dry lines about our inability to satisfy the inquiry, because your family, in our view, deserves a full account of the facts known to the club,
and not a formal brush-off, even where those facts do not permit any convenient conclusion to be drawn from them.
The club is not at present planning any further gatherings on that clearing, and the committee is not considering the question of its future use, so that none of us intends to return there in the near future. And should such a decision ever be taken, it will remain a separate matter, unconnected with the present reply. Should you have any further questions on the substance of your inquiry, the committee stands ready to consider them in the same order in which this letter was considered, and to answer as fully as the information available to the club allows. With this, the club considers your inquiry closed and thanks you for the patience shown while awaiting a reply. Yours faithfully, on behalf of the committee, the chairman of the club. I dreamed about our plateau last night, the same one where we always camp to watch the lights. Except this time, there were far more people than the four of us. I'll tell it in order, because in the dream itself, everything ran in order too. Nothing appeared out of nowhere, and nothing vanished all at once. Usually, I lose dreams like this before I'm even out of the tent, the moment I wake, but I kept the whole of this one, right down to who was sitting where by their own tent flap, and how many times through the night the red lights blinked on other people's cameras. There were maybe 20 tents up there, standing in a rough circle, every one of them facing the sky, and none of these people had come to walk anywhere. They'd come to stand still and watch. Everyone had a tripod, everyone had a thermos, and one or two held their cameras bare-handed, blowing on their fingers now and then without ever pulling away from the viewfinder. It was light out at night, a steady, trembling light from above, no moon and no stars, just the air itself over the plateau glowing, and it threw shadows on the snow, shadows of tents, of tripods, of the people themselves, and those shadows shifted a little even where nobody was moving, so that the whole air over the plateau seemed to sway gently in time with the light. Nobody really slept there. They lay in their bags with their eyes open, listening to the people on camera watch murmuring to each other nearby. In the dream, we were the same people who always go, only I can't say exactly how many of us there were this time, or who slept where. In the dream that felt normal, you just know everyone and you don't count them. In the morning, well, it was already morning inside the dream. I know how that sounds, but that's how it went in order. One of us walked over to whoever was in charge there and said we were staying another night, that it was already decided and there was no need to pack up. I stood next to him, listening, and I couldn't remember anyone discussing this in front of me, but in the dream that felt normal too. Once it was said, it was settled, and I didn't feel like asking twice. Then I walked out to the far edge of the site, where we usually set the camera up away from everyone else's light. And on the way, I noticed a trail, already packed down, though I was sure I was the first one out there that night. And when I turned round to look at my own tracks, the snow behind me lay smooth, smoothed over far more than my own footsteps should have left it. I didn't think much of it at the time. In a dream, things like that just slide past you. You keep walking, and you don't ask yourself where somebody else's trail came from, in a place where nobody should have been ahead of you. "Wait," one of the others at the table said, not letting me finish. "Did you not find a glove out there? I found one this morning, right on the trail, on the side where we don't set the camera up. Thought it was somebody's, brushed the snow off, put it in my pocket. It's still in my coat." I told her that awake, I hadn't even looked that way. In the dream, though, I walked that trail several times through the night. The snow behind me kept coming out smoother than it should have, and the trail ahead of me kept turning up already packed down, as though someone had walked through just in front of me and always managed to vanish before I came round the tent. By the end of that night, I'd stopped counting the trips. I just went wherever the trail led, and on the way back, I stopped checking whether any tracks were left where I'd just been standing. The next night in the dream, though the night there never actually ended, only the light kept changing. The same one of us went up to the man in charge again and promised something else, this time to someone from the far side, where the tents stopped and there was nothing but darkness with no light overhead. I didn't catch the words, only saw him nod, and the man in charge nod back, and everyone around us let out a breath, though nobody had asked anything out loud. I walked out to the far edge again to check the camera and found the same trail waiting, packed down ahead of me just enough to make walking easy, and behind me, where I'd just come from, the snow lay so smooth it looked as though nobody had ever walked there. Not once, not ever. "My memory card's odd," another one said, not looking up from her mug. "There are 2 frames right after each other. In one, there's no trail at all by the far edge, and in the next, it's already there. I figured the file was corrupted and didn't show it to anyone." "And my phone's track is odd too," someone else added, pulling out their phone without even looking at it. "That night, the GPS logged a stretch of path we definitely never walked, right in the same spot, by the far edge, out and back, a loop, as if someone had gone for a walk with my phone in their pocket, and I never even woke up, never felt a thing." This kept happening. I couldn't say exactly how many times. You don't count things like that in a dream. Someone would go out again in the morning and come back having already settled everything. Another nod, another shared breath with no question in it. And to this day, I couldn't tell you who it was. I never once caught a face. I only ever heard the voice from behind. And asking straight out in the dream somehow felt out of place, as if it had all been arranged long ago and a question would be beside the point, as if someone had settled it for us before we'd even arrived. And all that was left for us was to nod along after the man in charge. Sometimes it felt like a different person each night, and sometimes like the same one. From behind, everyone in the same kind of jacket looks the same anyway, hood up, hands in pockets, and there's no telling one silhouette from another at the edge of the light. Everyone's camera batteries died at more or less the same time, and for that 1 minute, nobody had any light but the sky, only the screens went dark. And that was usually when the talk by the tent started up. By the last night, if it even was a night, since it never once went dark there, the talk by the tents ran on longer than usual, and the one of us who always had it all settled didn't stop at a nod this time. He said it out loud, quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, that we were staying, and not for one more night, but for good, and there was nothing left to ask twice, because there was nothing left to decide. Nobody asked twice. I went, as usual, to check the camera at the far edge, and this time the trail behaved differently. Ahead of me it was empty and smooth, as though nobody had come through this way at all. Not one footprint, not one dent in the crust, nothing but a level skin of snow all the way to the horizon. Behind me, for once, lay real tracks, my own, loose and deep, exactly the way a footprint in fresh snow ought to look, as though the snow had finally stopped smoothing itself over behind me. I stood there a long time, just looking ahead at the empty ground, as though I were being given a moment to get used to there being no one left to go on ahead of me, and no reason left to keep going. "And our booking really has been extended," someone said, not looking up from their mug. "I saw the paperwork yesterday. There's an extra day on it, and a signature. I didn't look closely whose." Nobody was surprised.
Somebody just passed the sugar, and the talk hung for a second before it carried on as usual, as though an extra day tacked onto the booking were an ordinary thing for this group, as though it had always been that way, and none of us could honestly say we'd ever decided it ourselves. That's the whole dream. I've told it the way it went, without padding anything out or making anything up. You all know about the glove, the memory card, and the track as well as I do by now. I've just put it in the same order it came to me in. If they call again, I'll go.
The booking's already sorted anyway. My things from last time are still packed and sitting in the corner. The bus leaves from the same yard, and it's the same group. No need to call anyone new. It's a day's drive there and a day back. The time off fits neatly, and the lights don't show up every winter this time of year, so it would be a waste to pass it up if they do call. The glove's still sitting in the coat. Nobody's thrown it out, and nobody's gone looking for whoever it belongs to. We decided somebody would recognize it on the spot if it came to that. The track's still on the phone too, sitting in the memory next to everything else. Nobody's deleted it, though it wouldn't take long to. I'm not about to tell anyone they should do this, and I'm not calling anyone along. It's just that if I'm asked, I'll say yes, because honestly, I don't have a reason to say anything else. Write it down, will you? My hands haven't worked right since that winter. The letters come out like someone else's, not mine. So I've asked you to write it in my place, and you keep quiet while you do it. That suits me better. I've got used to nobody answering back. Are you keeping up? Right. On we go then. There were 4 of us climbing, in winter, 3 days straight. First along a track that was already cut, then along a path we trod ourselves through fresh snow. And I remember that by the end of the second day, I couldn't tell the slope from the sky anymore. Both had gone the same flat gray. We were going because one of the lads had heard about this place somewhere, about a spring the locals don't like talking about. We were headed for a hollow between 2 ridges where a wild spring rises, hot, nobody's, untouched. Just a crack in the rock with steam coming off it the whole time. Snow all around. Ordinary mountain snow, up to the knee. But down in the hollow, there was no snow at all. And the stones by the water were bare, warm even through a glove, with some kind of green grass growing right out from under them. We pitched the tent away from the water, off to one side, on level ground. But the earth there was warm all the same, warm for a good few yards out from the spring. And that was the first thing I noted about the place. Not the water itself, the ground around it. That first night I lay on that ground, and warmth came up from below, steady, like a stove, only without the smell of smoke or the crack of burning wood, just warmth. And it comes up from the ground earlier than the time before. Except back then, I didn't even know there'd be a time before to speak of, because this was the first time. I lay there, listening to the frost ticking away outside, warmth underneath me, and I thought, what luck to have pitched right here, of all the places in these mountains. That was when I saw him for the first time, by chance, because I couldn't sleep. I stepped out of the tent for a minute to look at the stars, and out there the stars hang low, huge, much closer than at home. And on the far slope, across the hollow, along the very path that had taken us 20 minutes that afternoon, someone crossed it in the time it would take me to count to 30. No more. Just walked across, steady pace, no running, no hurry. As if distance worked differently for him than it did for me. And it didn't even strike me as strange straight away, because his stride was perfectly ordinary, unhurried. Only somehow, at that ordinary pace, he'd covered what would have cost the lads and me half our breakfast and a full warm-up the next morning. I didn't call out to him. It never even crossed my mind at the time. Just a man going about his business, only too fast for the distance. I stood a while, watched him disappear behind the ridge, then went to sleep, and the ground under me was warm again, and I dropped off quicker than I should have. Put it down to the climb, the mountain air, anything at all rather than what I'd actually seen. On the second evening, the warmth came earlier than it had that first night. I still had my boots on, still standing by the tent, and I already felt it from below, through the soles, as if the ground wasn't waiting anymore for me to lie down, as if it were reaching up for me instead, and that was when it started to unsettle me. Not the warmth itself, but the fact that it was in a hurry. And that same evening, I saw him again. The one who walks too fast, closer now, right by the water, at the edge of the firelight. And he didn't come over, didn't speak, just stood there a minute, looking at the water, or maybe the tent, I couldn't tell, then walked off the same ordinary way, over the ridge, in less time than it would have taken me to run to the next tent. None of the lads saw him, not one of the four, I asked round carefully, and they all looked at me the way you look at someone who just can't sleep in the mountains. By day, we hardly thought about any of it. We walked round the hollow, watched where the water rose from, tried to make out the bottom through the steam, talked about whatever people talk about on the third day in the mountains. Food running low, who'd be first over the pass on the way back, all sorts of nothing. And the whole time the ground round the spring stayed warm, steady, without a break. And that steady warmth made the whole idea of what happened at night feel a little further off in daylight, a little quieter, as if it belonged to some other place altogether, far from this particular hollow. Cross that out, I said it wrong. The right word was imagining things, because that's what they thought, though nobody said it out loud. I know that look when I see it, but I wasn't imagining anything, because on the third day, I met him again, in broad daylight, far from the spring, somewhere with nothing underfoot but snow, no reason for any warmth at all, and even so, while I stood there catching my breath after the climb, warmth came up from the ground, straight through the snow, through my boots, and that frightened me far more than the man on the slope, because at least I'd seen the man, while the warmth came from nowhere, in a hurry, a little earlier each time than the time before. Listen carefully now. This is the important part. On our last night there, I barely slept, lay listening to the other three breathing in the dark, waiting for the warmth to come, because by then I knew it would come. The only question was, how soon? And it came at once, the very second I lowered myself onto the ground, as if it had been waiting for me the whole time, standing ready somewhere down there, under the rock, under the snow, under the whole mountain. And before I'd even settled myself properly, warmth was already coming up from below, steady and alive, steadier than on any of the nights before. And in that same minute, right at the edge of the tent, I heard footsteps. Not running, ordinary, unhurried even, but so quick that inside half a minute they were already where it would have taken me a quarter of an hour to walk to in daylight. And I lay there without moving, feeling the warmth from below and those footsteps outside, both at once, warmth and footsteps, as if they were part of the same thing. And they went past, close by, without stopping, moved on, away to where the slope drops into darkness, past the reach of the embers' light. And I didn't hear them again that night. Only the warmth stayed, steady, as if nothing at all had gone past. In the morning we packed up and started down, ordinary pace, ordinary path. Nothing else happened. Not that day, not the next. Just a trail like any trail, a descent like any descent.
Only the whole way down I kept thinking about how the ground up there had been in such a hurry to warm me, and I couldn't work out why. And at the station, once we were back, buying our tickets home, the woman at the counter asked me why my papers were dated a day later than the other threes. And at first I didn't understand the question, made her repeat it, asked to see the ticket again, as if the numbers could just get muddled on their own. I laid out on the counter everything we had with us, tickets there and back, old receipts from the shop at the foot of the mountain where we'd bought food before the climb, the lads' notebooks where each of them had marked the date every evening, and all three of theirs matched, one to the next, in a neat row, while mine, on every single paper I'd carried up there myself, showed a day more, as if I'd spent a whole day longer up there than the others, even though we'd come down as one group, on one path, sleeping in the same places every night. And I remember every one of those days on its own, clearly. Except for one, which isn't written down anywhere, not in anyone's memory, not on one paper, not on a receipt, not on a ticket. Only in that difference between my date and the other threes, which the woman circled in pencil and handed back to me, without explaining, because there was nothing to explain it with. That's all of it. You can stop writing now. No, wait. Put this down too. Since that winter, my hands have been like this.
He picks up the receiver by the window because that's where the signal holds steadiest, and pins the cord under his elbow while he pours himself tea from a kettle that's long overdue for a proper clean inside. There's a white scale built up in there, and every time he promises himself he'll deal with it next week. The call starts with the usual things. His sister asks about their mother's birthday present, whether he'll manage to collect a parcel from the post office before the weekend, and about the old mincer she's been hunting for through the whole flat and can't find. He answers in order, holding the receiver against his shoulder while the radio mutters low in the next room. Something about a cyclone coming in from the west, the announcer's voice as level as everything else in this flat at this hour of the day. "What?" he says, missing the question about the mincer, and his sister repeats it, and he says the mincer's probably at his place. He borrowed it back in the autumn and forgot to give it back. From there, the conversation slides, on its own, into the trip he got back from a few days ago. A group of 5 or 6 adults, a slope in the forest, snow up to the knee, and a spot someone had pointed them to back in summer. A wide clearing in front of a black opening in the snow, a trodden path leading up to it, tents pitched in a circle, a tarp strung over the kitchen area, the stove and the fuel cans lined up beside it, tidied away the evening before so nobody had to hunt for them half asleep in the morning. Part of the group went down there for a full day, while he stayed up top with 2 others, by the fire, by his own gear, filling the hours between cooking and gathering firewood, listening to the flames crackle in the frozen quiet of the slope. The cold held at around -20, and the air was so dense and so empty that it seemed to hold nothing extra at all. No smell of smoke until the fire really got going. No smell of food until you opened it. Just dry cold. The kind where anything that isn't burning or cooking right this second simply doesn't smell at all. And for the first day, he even found something pleasant in that. The world around him scrubbed clean of everything extra, smells included. There's nowhere for a smell to come from in cold like that. That's what he tells his sister, in the same words he told himself there, at the camp, on the first evening, when 2 of the people who'd come up from below that day, brushing themselves off by their tent, asked him straight out, "What is it that smells around here? Not smoke, not food, but something not theirs, like wet wool and an old fire that certainly wasn't one of theirs." He told them then that nothing smelled, that there was nothing here to smell of, and they didn't argue, just glanced at each other and went for their flasks. while he stood by his own tent a good while longer, sniffing, and found nothing but that same empty, frozen air in which, by every rule going, a foreign smell simply had nowhere to sit. By the second day, 3 people were talking about the smell, and not only the ones who'd gone down. One of the men who'd been up top with him from the start sniffed at his own jacket and said it smelled of someone else's clothes, sour and familiar, as if it had been dried over a fire that wasn't his own. "No, that's not what I mean," he cuts in when his sister remembers that in spring, the neighbor's stairwell stank of smoke, because this was an entirely different smell. Something lived in, something someone else's. The kind of thing that simply shouldn't exist in cold like this. And yet, by the second evening, the whole camp was talking about it. The food tasted of somebody else's cooking, and the insides of the tents smelled of someone else's home, though there was nothing inside them but their own gear, same as always. By the third evening, it had stopped being shared. The smell stopped hanging over the whole camp like an even cloud and started gathering where his own things were, by the flap of his tent, by his rucksack propped against its peg. One of the men who'd come up from below that day walked past, stopped, and asked whether he'd been drying his socks over someone else's fire, because his corner of the camp reeked as though they'd been burning the wrong wood there for years. And he answered again that nothing smelled, though by now he could feel it himself. The empty, frozen air was holding that foreign smell exactly where his own things stood, and nowhere else. "Wait, let me go in order," he tells his sister, who's already trying to skip ahead and find out how it ended. But first he has to explain how, on the 4th day, the ones who'd come up from below that day stopped asking altogether, just walked past his tent faster than usual, and one of them, that evening by the fire, not quite looking at him, murmured to the man next to him that the stink wasn't coming off the camp, it was coming off him, as if it were a joke, as if it were nothing, and nobody laughed. And the talk quickly turned to the next day's trip down and how much fuel everyone had left for the stove. "There's nothing to smell of in cold like that." He repeats it to his sister, just as firmly as he repeated it to himself back then, shaking his rucksack straight out onto the snow, looking for the source, going through his jacket, his flask, everything, one thing at a time, finding nothing outside himself that would explain what the others were feeling. And he himself still felt nothing unusual at that point, only the same, even, empty cold, without a single stray smell, which made it stranger still to hear, from people who'd come up from below, that something lived in, and not his own, was standing right next to him. Something that air like that had no business producing at all. At home, in the flat, 2 days after getting back, he calls it a smell for the first time in his own words, not somebody else's, when he pulls the unwashed jacket out of his bag to finally throw it in the machine and feels the same thing the others felt out there in the cold. A lived-in smell, not his own, definitely not his sweat, not dirty clothes after a week without a shower, more as though the jacket had spent a week hanging in someone else's house and his own tent had nothing to do with it at all. "Yes, I hear you," he says to his sister, who at that exact moment is saying something about their mother wanting him to call, and he listens with half an ear, still holding the jacket up, still sniffing at it, already understanding that it isn't about the jacket. The smell doesn't stay in the jacket, and it doesn't stay in the bag. He finds it in his own bed the next morning, in the pillow, even though the sheets were changed the same week he'd left, and in clothes he hadn't taken with him at all. And a day after that, he catches it coming off himself, straight off his skin, when he leans in towards the mirror in the hallway and, for a second, catches that same lived-in, faintly sour, not his own, smell, coming as if straight from under his collar, from the skin itself. The circle that had held around the tents out in the cold, and then around his own things, now seemed to have closed on him alone, and there was nowhere left for it to narrow to, unless it meant going wherever he went next, with him,
"Just a second, let me finish," he says, when his sister tries to cut back in with the mincer again, and finishes. That he's been home a week now, that the smell still hasn't gone, even though he's washed the jacket 3 times and changed the sheets twice, and that he never managed to find the source of it, however hard he looked. The radio in the next room switches to another station, and for a few seconds, all he can hear is its low murmur and the clink of a spoon against the edge of the cup as he stirs his cold tea, waiting for her to say something about the mincer, about their mother's present, about anything ordinary. His sister stays quiet a few seconds longer than she usually does when she's just listening, and then says, in the same level tone she'd used a minute earlier asking about the mincer, that her own place has smelled the same way for about a week now, from that exact day he's just named. She even remembers the day precisely, because that was when she was painting the kitchen window and decided the smell was the paint, and then the paint dried and the smell stayed exactly the same. She's never once been to his camp on that slope, never touched his rucksack, never taken his things out of his bag. None of his belongings are sitting in her flat. Only this smell, lived in and not hers, which started on the very same day his did. He asks her to say the date again, and she gives it back word for word, without a stumble, in the same level voice she used the first time, as though there were nothing in the question worth asking twice. After that, they're both quiet for a few seconds. He can hear her, somewhere in her own flat, step away from the phone and come back. Here's a short goodbye, and a promise to call about the mincer sometime that week. And the conversation ends as ordinarily as it began. A short click, a long dial tone, and silence in the room, where the radio was still murmuring low about the cyclone from the west, and the tea in his cup has gone completely cold while he held the receiver and listened.